Hello and welcome to the 41st episode of the Extreme Sports Performance podcast. My name is Ryan Blake. I'm the founder and director of Extreme Sports Performance as well as the host of this show. In this episode we're speaking to Lewis Hatchett. Lewis is an ex-professional athlete and a mindset coach. We discuss all things around mindset and how it can affect sport as well as life. We ask him the questions we ask all our guests. Really enjoyed recording this episode with Lewis, learnt a lot, hope you do too. Here we go. Lewis, welcome to the Extreme Sports Performance podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Mate, I've enjoyed our conversations before and I'm looking forward to this one again.
So for those who are listening and don't know who you are, could you please tell them who you are and a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, so my life right now is I'm a mindset and mental skills coach, and I work with athletes, corporates, and students. And it's quite simple, really, in the sense of I think of my job as being trying to help people feel good about themselves, and whether that's trying to create performance or underpin the people that they are to perform or just be the best version of them as a human being. And then an athlete second. And I would define an athlete as someone who is just essentially trying to benefit, to better themselves. But my previous version of my life before that was that I was a professional cricketer, and I played at Sussex down in the south coast of the UK. And I know you were at Surrey during my time there. So it was Surrey v Sussex. For the listeners, is a mortal enemy. It's the battle of the A23, the London v Brighton fixture. And I played there for 6 years as a pro, retired in 2016 through an injury. But I also have a fairly unique story of how I even got into the game in the first place, which we may get into.
Yeah, sure. We'll definitely dive into that later, but thanks for the intro. So what would you say the key moments are from your career A, as an athlete, but now B, as a mindset coach?
Probably, so like key moments that would say stick out in my mind. I mean, there's loads really, but there's sort of these seminal moments that I think that happen along your journey. I think one of them for me was initially when I was younger was sort of a moment that my parents can almost pin down to the day that I said I wanted to be a professional athlete. Like they told me I was sitting at a dinner table and I slammed my fist on the table and I just said, I want to be a professional cricketer. I had been playing cricket in the garden with my brother before then. My school didn't have cricket. I wasn't in a county setup or a professional setup in a youth development setup by any stretch of imagination. But I was also just super keen on the sport and played it in a club. And we would go and watch professional matches, sort of go to not a 2020, but we go like a 4-day game and things like that. And we'd go watch Sussex. I was a Sussex fan. I'm born there. That's what I wanted. So there was that moment that I would say is like a key moment of just like deciding to take that route. And that was a journey of trying to go into trials and things like that and trying to work my way in. But I wasn't actually very good. I wasn't a very good player by any stretch of imagination. I was nowhere near the level of some of the guys who were bigger, stronger, better than me. And then another defining moment, memorable, was when I actually first got injured. I had a spinal fracture when I was 16. Bowling is pretty bad for your body, but I was probably about 60 kilos dripping wet. I had no muscle on me, but I was just bowling myself into the ground. Had never picked up a barbell in my life. And that I actually spent 2 years out of the sport. And then I think fast forward 4 years to the day I actually got told I was going to turn pro. So there's a lot that happened in that gap, and there's a lot of training that happened, and then that being quite a defining moment of my life. The day you get told you're going to do the thing that you've sort of set out your goal to do and dreams and achieve all of those aspirations. Next seminal moment, probably fast forward another 6 years, was the day I got told I had to retire. I had to leave the sport at 26 years old. And that has then cascaded into a range of events that have now brought me towards the work that I'm doing. So very naturally, my work after finishing being a pro was I'd get people approach me to ask me about coaching, or how do I bowl hit in this, because I was a fast bowler. How do I get better at fast bowling? I also was building out a bit of a background in, I did a PT course. I became a qualified PT, qualified yoga teacher, mindfulness coach, breathwork coach. I just literally delved into the physical world quite intensely, but much more from a holistic point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people were asking me about that because they'd seen me, one, do it, and they were too curious about it for themselves. But the conversations that tended to happen with the people whilst I was coaching them were around mindset, just had naturally progressed into that because of not only me making it in the game, but my unique story before and overcoming adversity and challenge and what it took for me to get there. And then that piqued my curiosity. I've always been a curious person. I've always been very deep and thoughtful, and I was highly motivated. I was already giving keynote speeches around sort of, again, this way in which I got into the sport. But I thought I could offer more. So that's led me down a performance psychology route, doing my master's in performance psychology at Bangor University. And yeah, then those conversations became coaching conversations, and had now built into an actual program, course, an online academy, and working with people one-to-one, and schools and corporates and things like that. So yeah, all of that, there's these little seminal moments. It's a good question, really, because there's all these little pinpoint moments that sort of, one, changed the direction of my path,
Yeah.
but developed into something and evolved. And I think there was always an overlying message or path in which I was going. I think just a how and what slightly changed along the way, and then eventually it's become what it is.
Sure. So what would you say your mindset was like when you found out that you were going to be a pro athlete versus when you found out that journey had to end?
Yeah, so it might be worth precursoring it with my story of how I got into the game.
Yeah. Please do.
So for people that may not have come across me, that I was born with a rare condition called Poland syndrome, which is 1 in 100,000 people get it. It's no known cause as to why you get it. Twice more common in men than it is in women, and it's a physical anomaly. Essentially, I'm missing my right pectoral muscle and 2 ribs that are directly behind it. So the only thing that's protecting my upper right portion of lung is just skin. If I was to get hit by a cricket ball there, especially at a professional level, it could be a fatal injury. But I grew up with knowing I had the condition. My parents knew, but I did hide it from quite a lot of people. And the condition means that I'm considerably weaker on my right side, and I've got a lot less mobility on my right side than I do my left. Now, I'm a left arm bowler. I throw left-handed. I bat left-handed, but even batting left-handed means that my right rib cage is facing the bowler, which is where I could get hit. So I had things like, as a pro, I had a Kevlar chest guard made, which is bulletproof, not only could stop a cricket ball, but a bullet.
Yeah.
And then I have physical challenges in the sense that I've got muscles that are doing jobs that a big muscle like the pec major should be doing. And so I have muscles that compensate. I get regular headaches and tightness and those sort of migraines, just ongoing pain and discomfort, and an asymmetry in my body. So essentially I'm not symmetrical. So that's got a lot of challenges that came with it. And with it meant that I was physically not as strong as everyone else. I was the underdog. I was hiding this condition. And throughout my journey, I was always told that I wasn't necessarily very good, and that there were or if anything, there were people that were much stronger, better at this job than me.
Yeah.
And that mindset for me early on, my mindset as a youth in that setting was built around being an underdog. It was, I had a lot of inspiration and motivation from just other stories of people that had overcome challenges and made it in the past, whether it was an athlete that had an illness or a para athlete that was doing something. I would gain inspiration from the fact that if they could do something like that, then maybe I could as well. And then I looked at what everyone else was doing, and I would say, okay, if someone else is doing something one way, I'm going to need to do it 3 times harder in order to just get even. Yeah, and I think this mentality that I had, which was I'm always behind, kept me striving. I'm always behind. I'm always looking for something. Now I could get into why that was actually that is not only a benefit but also a curse at the same time. But that mentality and that mindset really helped me just constantly push, look for ways in which I could be better than other people that were able-bodied, had far more talent than me, and allowed me to just get myself on a level playing field with them. So that was an approach I had when I was really young. So I've got this condition, I'm behind the eight ball with it, and I'm essentially trying to work harder than everyone else. When my friends were going out partying, I was training. And I took real pride in that, because if anything, I was always trying to be proud of the character that I hope I could be. I thought, okay, if people revere these characters that try and work hard and are motivational, then there's no real reason why I can't, and especially with what I've got. And I think I just was very early on in recognizing what made me unique, where my unique my unique selling points were, and then hone in on that and be like, right, I'm going to drive this as hard as I can. And whether it works or not, I don't know, but I'm just going to keep going harder and harder. And I'm going to try and do more than everyone else. So that's an early mindset I had. Then once you start getting into adolescence, you start to get insecurities and things like that. And it became a little bit harder. But as a pro, once you turn pro, the game just changes. Like it's no longer this dream or hobby that you were hoping to turn into something. It's now something that everyone else is chasing you for, or you possibly could have someone signed from another team and brought into your position at any one time. And that happened in a lot of my cases. Yeah. And it changes, and the possibilities and the facilities or the opportunities that you get are drastically different and better. But with it comes a lot of pressures that go along that. And I think a lot of my time spent there, I had a lot of fear in me, because one, some of the environments that I was in, the environment that I went into, the team that I went into was a very successful team at the time, or coming off the back of being one of the most successful teams, if not the most successful team in a decade in county cricket's history. And going into that room was kind of like walking into the Man United of '96. It's just full of heroes of the game. They've all got outrageous careers, but the standards were so high. And if you didn't meet those standards, you were not ostracized, but it was obvious if you didn't meet those standards. Now I actually love those environments, because they're self-driven, they're really high standards, but they can be, there's a very, very close fine line between how challenging they can be and how relentless they can be and unrelenting they can be, depending on the amount of support that you've got. And so just being around that as a youth was quite daunting. And so then you start to build your skill set, you start to understand yourself in the game. And then by the time I was sadly retiring, or I was 26 and just figuring it out, the confidence was really starting to kick in. I really understood my game. I was really excited about where it went. And then unfortunately for me, it just ended very, very abruptly, which is sort of the worst case scenario. And then, your world is just turned upside down after that point.
I can imagine. So along that kind of continuum you've just kind of described, the reflections you've had, what would you say the most valuable things that you learned were that still stick with you today?
I think being a young cricketer, I was always trying to be like other people. I was always trying to emulate some of my heroes and trying to find my own way. And it took me a little while to then realize that being my own cricketer and my own athlete was the biggest benefit that I could have. And rather than trying to necessarily copy what other people did, be inspired by it and then do it in your own unique way. That for me was, I think, one of the lessons I learned along the way. It was a mistake I was making to begin with. And then along the way, I think and you'll appreciate this from a physical training point of view, cricket sort of early between 2005 to almost 2015, from a S&C point of view, was really trying to find its feet. It didn't really know what was possible or what was the potential was. So I remember like when my first gym program was quite literally a copy and pasted gym program from a Northampton Saints rugby player. And I packed on muscle and bulk. And while that was great because it gave me an amazing base level of what training was, lifting heavy, what that all felt like, weighing 94 kilos or 95 kilos was not what I needed, because it then put pressure on my knees and things like that. So the actual things that I learned along the way was how to train smart specifically to the sport and use rest recovery. But I think that's the physical side. I think from a mental side, the comparison of others, the feeling of not having to get everything perfect was something that for me, I struggled with. I wouldn't play a game unless I felt 100% ready or perfect. In a previous episode of on my podcast, I can't remember which guest it was, but we'd spoken around the idea of feeling ready and being ready. It's a very different thing. You can feel ready. You may not be ready, but you want to feel ready. You want to feel like you've got some form of capabilities. And I think I never felt like, I felt like if I needed to feel ready to be ready. And actually, there's sometimes where you can be ready, but may not feel ready.
Yeah.
And that's fine. That's actually fine. But one of my coaches in Australia had pointed it out to me around, I think I was about 18 at the time. He was like, Lewis, you're constantly looking for things to be like bang on perfect and always right, when actually it's never always going to be perfect. It's never going to be right. But unless you put yourself out there, learn about what's going on this day, you'll never get it. And I look back at that now, and that's so true, because essentially the thing that makes elite athletes is the fact that they have experiences. Whether they go well or badly is immaterial, because it's what they learn from that experience that they can genuinely use for the next game. Now, if you don't even put yourself in that experience and don't even take that step, you're not going to get the experience or the learning, whether it's a good or a bad. And who knows? So that day could be your best day, and you could suddenly click, and you were potentially going to walk away from it. Like, yeah, that's a big change that I had. Actually learning that not everything needed to be perfect in order for me to perform. Yeah, there was a fair bit in there, but those would be some of the things I guess I could take out of it.
No, bro, no, thank you for sharing that. It reminds me of my favourite phrases, that you are the 1% away from succeeding or 1% away from failing, but you're never going to know until you try. So, mindset coaching, what is it? How can it help people?
There's ways in which people do it differently, but my version of doing it is essentially focusing on getting yourself into the best possible place you can for what is in front of you. And that could be your goals in a long time. That could be trying to reach your goals that are in 5 years away, right? But it could also be, I've got a performance coming up and I want to do the best I possibly can. It can also be based on making yourself feel, and I've siloed my work into essentially some other mindsets. I have learned that the coaching that I do is about changing your perspective and how you see the world or how you see experiences. And so my coaching to change that perspective needs to have a bedrock of confidence. So we're all looking for confidence, essentially. We're all trying to seek out some form of confidence. But a lot of us think we want performance confidence when actually we want self-confidence, because you can't necessarily have one without the other. And the other being resilience. So if you're worried about something, you're fearing something, that could be because you may not feel capable to handle getting knocked down on your ass and not being able to deal with it. And then the last bit, that perspective, is sort of like, what does this all mean? Like, why am I putting too much pressure on myself because I'm making this such a focused effort or a very small world that I'm living in? So bringing in essences of community and purpose and a bigger picture as to why you're doing it. When we have a dedication to what we're doing, it takes the pressure off a little bit. But most of it, there's so many different aspects to mindset coaching, in my opinion. I mean, I have quite literally branded it in that sense, because for me, I never wanted to see a psychologist. I sort of ran away from the idea of seeing a psychologist because the stigma was still there, and sometimes still is there. I get clients coming to me now because I don't feel I want to see a psychologist, because seeing a psychologist makes it feel like there's something wrong with me. But if I'm working with a mindset coach, it almost feels not necessarily cooler, but it feels more proactive. It feels more sort of tougher, essentially. Yeah. And that's sort of how I wrap it. But a lot of the world is taken from performance psychology. But it's also, I use my own experiences. The benefit I've had is I've actually been on the other side of the fence. I've actually felt what it feels like, what those anxieties feel like. So if I could quite simply say, what is it that I'm trying to do with people? And that is to lower anxiety and increase confidence. That's the simple equation that I try to do. What creates that is a wide range of things, depending on the individual. But ultimately for me is that if we can we reduce the anxiety that you feel, start to lower that down and bring out your confidence. And within that is really about finding who you are as a person. What are you like as a human being? What do you like as an athlete? How do you want to do this? How do you want to go forward? What does your work look like? What is the work going to look like for you? And building that relationship with someone to try and help them, yes, mentally deal with it. Because if you look at sport right now, most of the people at the top, they're very, very similar in their physicalities, their skill levels, things like that. But the thing that makes the difference between the top and the very, very top is mindset, is just how they approach the game, is how they approach life, how they manage all of that. And those that are doing that are actively working on it.
Yeah, sure. No, that's fascinating. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Are there any examples that you could share with us of how it's helped you in your career, and or there are case studies of other athletes that you know about or have heard about has helped them, or any people you've worked with that you've seen really good success stories with?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can look at there's a lot of stuff that you can type into Google where athletes, or you'll see on the news every now and then, a mindset, a psychologist or a mental skills coach has been brought into a team, or even has started working with an athlete.
Yeah.
And I think the one thing that I found, which I'd add, is that the idea of bringing one in is not necessarily a plaster over a cut. It's not, you also hope that person is not bringing you in because they've just now got a problem. A lot of the people, that could be something you could do, and you may be able to help in that moment. But probably more often than not, you want to have been starting that work so that you don't really get to that stage. Mm-hmm. But for examples of, I think for my own personal examples, I didn't have a great experience in this sort of realm when I was playing, because again, there was so much stigma around doing it. There was even stigma around being on the physio bed. So for me, I didn't have a great experience. And I think that's probably a part of the motivation behind what I'm doing right now, which is trying to be the person that I didn't really have at the time, or delivering it in a way that would have resonated with the younger version of me. But I think examples I've had is working with, say, like a couple of cricketers. Cricket's been a really great one for me because it's an easy in. But I've also had skeleton racers and rugby players and things like that. And more often than not, it's not necessarily the actual impact that you see straight away on the field of like, oh, I spoke to them this day and bang, they had an amazing performance. Yeah. It's not almost a quantifiable measure, because you could almost even argue that may not have even been my impact.
Of course.
But it's actually a more sort of subjective feel to it. So it's like, how are you dealing with the pressures of the season? Or I'm feeling a little bit lighter about this. Or, do you know what? I've just had this poor performance and I've just parked it. Mm-hmm. And you hear like these little, you sort of hear these touch points with them, and where they may have been emotionally wrapping their brains around it for like days, they've parked a performance, they've debriefed it, they've reviewed it, they've given it some perspective, they've taken the lessons from it, they've recognized what they were doing wrong, and they either want to put it into training or into the next game, or sometimes just completely move on, like just completely move on to the next one. So yeah, there's no sort of, I would say there's no certain measure that I've seen.
Yeah.
I'm sort of looking at different ways in which I can measure some, I guess, performance indicators along the way. So there are some measures around confidence and anxiety before games. But I am more interested about those nuances around them as a person. Like, how are you just generally feeling? Like, how is that? And half the work, mate, is essentially having these conversations with people. And I always say to people, people don't need teaching. They just need reminding.
Yeah.
A lot of this stuff, a lot of people kind of intrinsically know,
of course, yeah.
But they choose to either listen to the negative stories they're telling themselves, or they forget about what their true motivations are for the actual performance in front of them. It's so easy for a lot of these athletes to be extrinsically motivated for success, fame, outcomes, trophies, tournaments, whatever. But the thing I think is missing is when they forget about the intrinsics as to why they do it. An example is one of my athletes I work with, yesterday we had a call and we're just completely having a reset. Like, it just texts me, I want a complete reset of my game. And so we just start very basic to like the first question being, why are you playing the game? Why do you play? What is it about this game that is bringing you towards it? So you bring out real underlying purpose and reasons as to why you're doing it. And then you're moving on to, okay, what are you trying to achieve? What do you want to get out of this sport? What do you want to do? Is it a legacy? Is it just performing this year? Is it this next game? What is it you want to achieve? And then it's on to things like, what does the work look like? How do you want to go about doing the work? What are you doing right now? Is there a discrepancy between where you currently think you are and where you want to be? Is the work actually matching up to the level that you want it to be? You might like this. I actually have started approaching mindset coaching as like training in the gym. So I've started to, if I program something with someone, I'll look at their skill training and say, okay, how many times in that week are you actually throwing in a session where you're really pushing the level here, and you're pushing yourself out of the comfort zone? And I view it very similar to like long distance runners. I used to think, and when we used to do a lot of speed endurance work in cricket, so fast sprints, recover, sprint again, do that repeated. I don't know if you're familiar with 23/7s. You remember that?
Yeah.
So you do that over and over. Sprint for 85% sprint at 7 seconds, 23 seconds recovery. You do that, and I do about 8 sets of that, right? And that was what I thought fitness was becoming. Then I met on my podcast, I met a lot of long distance runners, and zone 2 training started to get this name. And I was like, what's zone 2 training? What is it? And essentially it's long distance runners that are running if they run 5 days a week, 4 of their sessions are at a very easy pace. It's the easiest, like they can have a conversation whilst they're running, and you watch them do it and it's really slow, but they're just putting miles in their legs and it's kind of just ticking over, building up a base fitness. But then one day is where they go into zone 3, zone 4, and they go into threshold training and they really push it. They push speed. And then they drop back to the next few days of rest recovery or easy training that allows their body to recover to get to that next one. But what we find is like a lot of people in HIIT training has allowed this to happen, where people just nail themselves all day, every day. They don't allow their bodies to recover. And then 6 months down the line, they get an injury, right? But in sport, it can go, for mindset, it can go either one way. Someone could be really nailing themselves mentally. Like every session, they're pushing themselves as hard as they possibly can. Then they just get burnt out. Yeah. Sometimes people are just going through the motions. So what I've done is I've looked at say, right, okay, if you've got 5 training sessions in a week, be strategic about this. Like, and what's your overarching goal? If it's, you've got a technical goal, a tactical goal, a physical goal, write down all the different goals that you may have in all these different silos. Yeah. So if one of them is like a tactical goal or a technical goal, where in that week, other than the days where you're grooving and you're repeating and you're honing in that skill set, when are you really practicing putting it under pressure and how you deal with it under pressure? And putting in like a session where, if I use cricket as a really quick context, as a batter, are you just going into nets and like facing underarm bowling and grooving a technique and worrying about your technique? Or are you up against bowlers and doing that? And even up against bowlers, some people may think, okay, well, that gets my juices flowing and I start to feel that nerve. I don't want to get out to someone. And I've even challenged people on that and said, I don't think that's good enough. I don't think that's highly pressured enough. Mm-hmm. Getting out to your mates, getting out to your teammates in a training session, yeah, it's a bit of a bummer, but it doesn't give you that same fear and anxiety that you might feel in the middle, right? Or a set of challenge that you might feel when there's thousands of people watching you and TV cameras potentially on you. So we need to get you comfortable in an environment like that. Now, we can't replicate it. We cannot replicate that. That's one thing we can't do, but we can try to get close. So if you're facing bowlers next time, do something absolutely wild and like move the stumps another yard closer, obviously within reason, as long as there's not like a world-class fast bowler that could rip your head off. Yeah. But put yourself under some stretch of the imagination where it could be really challenging for you. It could be, and ultimately set yourself up to fail. Mm-hmm. Set your training session up so that you could possibly fail, because that's a part of your mindset you might need to deal with as well. The idea of I could fail and I could look ridiculous at this. And so that brings enough level of anxiety with it. And that is like this form of zone 3, zone 4 training that is like pushing it hard. so that then the other days you go back and you work on your technique, you work on trying to groove that, so that when you go back to under pressure, you don't have to think about it. Because one thing we know is that if people are under pressure and they're overthinking things and they're thinking about technique, they're thinking about where their feet are placed, they're thinking about what next move they're going to make, and it's not in this flow state, that's dangerous. They're out of it. They're overthinking. They've overcompensated. But you want to break it down and be simple. But you need to practice being in that pressure. You need to practice being in that mindset. And so that's how I've started approaching it with some athletes, and just trying to push them to go and do that. And funny enough, like, I know this because I did it. Like, I actually did this for myself. I prided myself on doing sessions where I would turn people's heads and go, that looks challenging. And also the benefit of the fact that I was doing it with the risk of my condition. And that was a threat for me. So if I could get hit, so I would get coaches to throw the ball much closer to me, much faster, because one of the roles I had to do in cricket was night watchman. It's a rubbish job. The bowlers, you're a sacrificial lamb. You get hit by the other bowlers. They're just trying to hit you, hurt you at the end of the day, so the batters get protected. But I knew if I was going to do that role, I needed to practice under very harsh conditions.
Yeah.
And so when I did it, none of the training I was doing was actually in that setting was about working on technique or tactics. It was about pure grit, determination, courage, bravery, fire up, get in the battle, and then get used to that. Find what flicked my switches, what got me into that position. Because a lot of people will easily go back to the training. If something's not going well, they'll easily go back to, it's my technique, it's my tactical nous. And more often than not, a professional cricketer or a professional rugby player or whatever, they're there because they're good enough. They're there because they've got something. Sometimes it's easier, it's nicer to go back to thinking about the tactics, the technique, because it's easy to train. It's really easy. It's comfortable training. It's a comfortable environment.
Of course.
And the one thing we know is to deal with tough environments is you've got to practice being in them.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's fascinating. Again, thank you for sharing that. It reminds us of another one of our favourite phrases, which is rising to your level of performance or falling to your level of preparation.
Totally, yeah.
And I think you've given a perfect example of that with what you've just said, because they're two very different things which can equally improve your game, but it's a very different approach
Another way I look at it as well is a lot of people will, if they're having a failure or if they're having something that potentially they don't want to happen, instead of trying to become less afraid of it, think about creating bravery and courage to face it. A lot of people will go and try and put in place a lot of mechanisms to just be less afraid, when actually you just need to be braver and you just need to be more courageous. And I know which one I would be prouder of myself for doing if I'm looking back on this moment in a year's time when I've done that thing.
And one will probably be a lot more comfortable than the other and require a lot more effort, but maybe the results would be greater.
100%, yeah. 100%.
Brilliant. So we have quite a diverse demographic of listeners. We've got lots of different types of athletes of very different levels and multiple sports. Lots of coaches listen. We have lots of teachers listen, and also parents. So if they're listening thinking, this is definitely something I'd like to explore more and find out more about, how can they do that? What resources do you have available? What could you steer them towards to kind of find out more information?
Yeah, so I put a ton of content out on social media. It's a bit of a beast sometimes, but I just try to put out information. I obviously have my own podcast, which I strip out messages, and I get to interview some amazing athletes and coaches and some psychologists as well, and authors, which is awesome. So there's that. There's that on Spotify, and a short plug, which is it's called Raising Your Game.
Sure thing. I'll put a link to this in the show notes for everyone listening, so you can access this.
Stay listening to this podcast, but there is that one as well if you love podcasts. But I also send out a weekly free email. So that email is literally a Friday morning email that I send out to give one piece of actionable advice around mindset and even mental health. And that is now, it's actually going to be steered more towards sport for sure. Mm-hmm. But if it's not necessarily relevant, because the idea is when I'm working with a corporate or or a student or anyone that's, I mean, I've worked with musicians and I've got someone talking about theatre at the moment. The idea is that I take sport, performance psychology, all of the mindset that you get from sport, because we revere sportsmen, right? We revere them for their mindset. So I'm taking all of that and trying to give it to people in a very easy and accessible way, and also hopefully a cool way. So there's that for email. But then if people want to go even a little bit deeper, I've got the Mind Strong Academy, which is an online academy where things like each month I run a mindset masterclass, which is a bolt-on from my Mind Strong course, which is an online version of the work and process that I would initially take an athlete through, so people can follow that in their own time. And then the last one is essentially just working with me one-to-one, so trying to work with me and having me as a personal mindset coach. So yeah, those are essentially. I don't think there's another resource I have, but yeah, there's a fair bit there.
Fantastic. So the website is
it's just lewishatchett.com. Most of my work can be found at lewishatchett.com. Real. Instagram at Lewis Hatchett. It's like TikTok, just type in Lewis Hatchett, and Twitter as well. But yeah, lewishatchett.com. And if you're interested in the academy, it's lewishatchett.com/mindstrong.
Fantastic. So yeah, I'll definitely put those links into the show notes. So if you're listening and you want to check those out, please click below. Thank you for your time today. It's been really interesting having a chat with you. I've been really excited about recording this with you because we've been speaking about a lot of cool stuff lately. Could you leave the listeners with an actionable takeaway piece of advice that you would maybe give them if they were looking to make a start with this, or they may be struggling right now with their mindset?
I would say probably the most common thing that I'm addressing with an athlete or anyone across the board is anxiety. So anxiety essentially comes from the idea of trying to control something that we can't control, but we want to control it. So that could be, I'm anxious about an outcome, I'm anxious about a performance, but we're trying to control something that either hasn't happened yet, has happened in the past, and as away from really what's going to allow us to work best in the moment. Now, I've always said the things that you essentially can control in your life are what you expect of yourself and what you think of yourself. So what you can expect of yourself is the effort you put in, the mindset, the approach that you have. Because even if you get all of that right, it doesn't guarantee results. It doesn't guarantee I could have the best mindset, the best out, I could even perform to my best on the day, but the opposition could have an absolute ripper. There could be stuff that happens in a game that just is not in my control. And an umpire makes a wrong decision, or a call just falls the other line, whatever it might be. And so what I end up coming back to is when we're doing that, when we're focusing on things we can't control but want to control them, it's really important to understand what in your life you can control. So it's an exercise that's on the course. I think it's in chapter 1, maybe chapter 2, but it's controllables versus uncontrollables. And it's a very simple exercise. Write down 2 lists, one that's got controllables, that says controllables, and one that says uncontrollables. Now, everything that's in your control can be your actions, your mindset, the effort you're putting in, your technical nous, your practice, the training you're doing. It could be the support that you're trying to go for, trying to get, the recovery you're doing, everything. Like everything that is genuinely in your control. And then go and write in the other list everything that's not in your control. And that could be outcomes, it could be results, it could be getting into a team, getting selected, it could also be umpire's decision, the weather, the environment, the facilities. Like all of these things are technically not in your control. You can influence them some way, but they're not all in your control. But the problem is we focus a lot on those uncontrollables, and we just constantly lose our minds over them. So when you do this process by simply writing them down and doing the cathartic process of getting someone to write it down, you can almost visualize it and remind yourself when you wrote something on that list, so that when you're in the moment, you're trying to think about, okay, I'm frustrated right now. Am I actually thinking about something that's on that controllables list or uncontrollables list? If you're feeling that anger, frustration, fatigue, anxiety, nerves, high chance that you're on that uncontrollable list. And then it's a quick shift. Okay, find something. What can I do right now that is in my control that can bring this? So even if I take an example of when people feel nerves, that's why we use breathing as a great example of dealing with nerves in the moment. It's because it's one of the first points of call of being able to have some form of control. I can control my breathing. I can take a deep breath on call and I can control that. So just by doing that physical practice of actually breathing and taking a deep breath, like you see all athletes doing in pressure moments, that's not only helping them with their nervous system on a physiological thing, but it's from a psychological point of view, it's like the first focus point of I've got some control back. I'm taking control of the situation by taking that deep breath. And then I'm going to do the next step and the next step. And that next step is all about, what am I trying to focus on? Am I trying to focus on where I'm trying to place this penalty in the goal, or where I'm kicking the ball, and all of that side of it? But writing down your controllables and uncontrollables list is one of my sort of go-to exercises for people to have a fair impact on what they're doing.
Wow, what an awesome piece of advice, and also so simple if you think about it, really.
I always say, like, a lot of my work is not actually, it's I've got a great job in the sense, but I ask very simple questions, but then they're sometimes not so easy to answer.
Brilliant, mate. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. Hope you've all enjoyed that, everyone listening. And Lewis, we'll speak soon.
Love it, mate. Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the 41st episode. We hope you enjoyed the show. It would really help us out if you could please leave a rating and or review on whatever platform you're listening on. Be sure to check out our website, extremesportsperformance.com, that has details about our consultancy services, our in-person and online coaching, our in-person and online education, our in-person and online support, our media pages, our contact details, and how to subscribe for free to stay informed about company news and updates. Don't forget to join our growing community on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. Links to these can be found at the bottom of our website and via any search engine. Until next time, take care.